And welcome again, all of you, to this lecture. It is a lecture on the Taos Cuarto Centenario, the 400-year celebration of Taos history. Now, is it the founding date of Taos? No, probably not, but it is probably the European founding of Taos, because it connotes pretty much the earliest presence of permanent European settlement here in Taos. And so it is also important, but even more important than that is it's probably the point in time that Taos, the name that we have now, at the point in time that Taos became Taos. Because prior to that, of course, the Taos Pueblo had existed, but it was under different names. Other names like Uraba, or Tiburon, or Valladolid. These are some of the names that were noted in the Coronado expedition, which had happened in the early 1500s, well, 1540s. So Taos, the name that we know now, was first scripted actually during the Oñate colonization in 1598. That's when we first see it in the historical record. But it was 1615 that it was officially used to proclaim or to name the Pueblo de Taos. At that time it was written down as El Pueblo de Taos. So those two points are significant about the history of Taos. But during the course of this lecture, I want you to remember 4 different dates, because we have some other anniversaries that we're celebrating. And so these are the dates: 1615, 1715, 1815, and 1915. There will be a quiz at the end. And I'll talk a little bit about the significance of each one of these different dates. But to not start it right at 1615, because we know that that's not when the true history of Taos started. In fact, we can claim the prehistory founding that dates to the time of the Taos Pueblo. But before that, about 9,000 to 10,000 years ago, there were what were called by the archaeologists the Paleo-Indians that were in the area. These were big game hunters that survived by following the megafauna, the mammoth, and the mastodon. And archaeologists tell us that they were all over New Mexico, probably passed through Taos at some point. The earliest archaeological evidence of these big game hunters in all of the United States actually exists in New Mexico. And the 2 primary archaeological sites for that are the Folsom site in northeastern New Mexico, and up by Folsom, and the Clovis site in southern New Mexico. So these are 2 of the earliest archaeological sites that we have. And there are a number of archaeological sites throughout New Mexico. So this evidence was all around us, but it was not so much in Taos Valley itself. We don't find that many artifacts, whether they're bones or stone weapons or spear points, given as evidence of the big game hunters in Taos. I don't see Dr. John Young here. He's usually at just about every one of these lectures, and he's a longtime member of the Historical Society. But he could tell us about the Cody knife that was found near Frijoles Canyon in 1988. So this was kind of one of those rare artifacts that we have found close by. But we find them all over New Mexico. In the San Luis Valley, there's a lot of evidence of the Paleo-Indians, the game hunters. But a more significant group that affected the settlement of Taos were the Anasazi. Here again, it's a label that was given by the archaeologist. It's not a label that the natives at that time called themselves. But the Anasazi were located primarily in the Four Corners area in north central New Mexico. And they were characterized by having family clans. They built pueblos. They, at some point in time, had kivas, and they made permanent settlement. They did agriculture, And they came about 2,000 years ago. So about the time of Christ, about 2,000 years ago, they came about. And they had different time periods. For example, they had the basket maker period in the first 500 years of being in the area, the modified basket makers, and the pre-Pueblo, the developmental Pueblo, and then the regressive Pueblo. And about 1,000 years ago, splinter groups of these Anasazi then began coming into the Taos Valley to make permanent settlement. And they lived, they were able to survive by building pit houses. So about 1,000 years ago, they were building pit houses all around the Taos Valley. And the way they would do it is they would dig down into the ground, and once they got below the frost line, and then dug down a little bit deeper, 6 or 8 feet, they had a comfortable 58 degrees, or 55 degrees, whatever it is. And then in the severest part of the winter, they could build a fire in the corner and vent it out and be able to survive that way. And then in summertime, it provided a nice cool shelter for them during the summer heat. So they survived for the first 1,000 years. Archaeologists aren't exactly sure that they put the date at the late 900s, early 1000s. That we have evidence of the first archaeological sites in the Taos Valley. And so then they started building different pueblos, different parts of the country. They had at least a couple of origins. In other words, they weren't just one people from one place. And the archaeologists assumed this because the pit houses that they built were different. In the southern part of the valley, around the ranchos, they tended to be more round. In the northern part of the valley, they tended to be square or rectangular. So, but there were probably even more than a couple origins of these splinter groups of Anasazi. But they started building pueblos at some point in time. They built a pretty good sized pueblo near the Llano Quemado, the Ponce de Leon hot springs. And then there was a cornfield pueblo near the location of the present pueblo. And then there was Pot Creek in the area where SMU now has a campus, and they've done extensive archaeological digging there. And it was the largest of the pueblos, and it was built about 1200. And the archaeologists kind of call this a coalition time period, where these scattered groups of people living out in pit houses started coming to the city. That's something that we still do. Our kids go off to the city, bright lights and jobs and different attractions. But the pueblo of Paw Creek then survived good condition for a while. But after a while, and archaeologists don't know for sure whether it was drought, disease, or social unrest, whatever. By the early 1300s, they started leaving. So about 1320 to 1350, they were leaving the Pot Creek site. And these Tiwa-speaking Native Americans now some were going to Picudis Pueblo, where they would build a Picudis Pueblo. Some would come to Taos and build the multi-storied structures that we see today here at that time. And so the founding date of Taos, then, from the indigenous perspective, I guess we could say either at the time of the construction of the Taos Pueblo, which archaeologists put at about 1350, and it's kind of a happy medium because they know it happened more or less in the 14th century. And the exact date was not a historical date because the historical record is based on what's written down, is based on archaeological data and artifacts. And so some even give the date as late as 1450, which could have been the case that they, in fact, it did take them 100 years to actually build the structures that we see there today. But certainly by 1540, when the Spaniards arrived on the scene, the Pueblo was there. To a couple contingents off the Coronado expedition of the 1540s arrived in Taos. 1540, Hernando de Alvarado, and then in 1541, Francisco Vallanuevo. But they didn't stay. They didn't build anything. They visited. They left, and so that cannot be considered the founding date of Taos, even for the Europeans. But for the Native Americans, it could be either the early construction of the pit houses 1,000 years ago, or the construction of the beginning of the construction of Taos Pueblo about 1340. But back to the 1600s, when the Europeans finally arrived on the scene. Again, the commemoration or the celebration that we have this year is important because usually the founding dates of different locations are kind of pretty much well established. It's a European notion anyway of establishing or talking about founding dates. The Native Americans tend to look more at time and space and place, and not so much at the timeline, chronological sequence of events the way the Western society looks at it. And so St. Augustine, Florida is the oldest continuously occupied European settlement in the United States. Dates to 1565. And then the second oldest is Jamestown, Virginia, the first British colony, dates to 1607. Then Santa Fe, New Mexico, Santa Fe, Nuevo Mexico, 1610. And then Taos, arguably, then is the fourth at 1615. But then why should we settle for 1615 as a settle date when we could say that basically the Taos Pueblo is the oldest town in America. A continuous habitation, especially looking at the residents, we could say that it is the oldest continuously inhabited residence in the whole country. And Acoma kind of claims to be the oldest, but we know that wasn't continuous after 1600, after Oñate got here, and they don't have one established residence that they can claim is continually occupied. But other things then that we attribute to the 1600s, and besides the name, because the name was actually first scripted during the Oñate colonization in 1598. Again, the Taos Pueblo had been there, it existed for 200 or 300 years, but under different names. And the Taos name itself then came about, we think that it's a derivation of an Indian term that began with T, sounded like Taos, but then it was Hispanicized and pluralized into Taos. And then it was first used officially by the Spanish government, proclaiming or naming the Taos Pueblo at that time. But another important thing happened in 1615, and that is that the construction of the first church at the Pueblo, the first San Jerónimo church, was being built. And this goes back a little bit too, because at the time of the colonization by Oñate in 1598, as early as September of 1598, Oñate assigned Franciscan Fray Francisco Zamora as the priest of the Taos Pueblo, but nothing much happened, and there are no historical accounts that he was actually here or was living here at that time. But there are some historical accounts that indicate he was here by 1603. And what was he doing? Well, maybe he was trying to convert a few people to Catholicism, maybe had the idea out there about building a church, but by 1615, the church was being built, and this then signifies the first European structure, which is one of the criteria we look like for a founding date. So it signifies the founding of Taos from the European perspective. And the third thing that happened was that this was the onset of permanent settlement by European colonists, which were Spaniards, and they would began coming, not in great numbers. It probably wasn't very many. We know even by the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 that there were only about 70 Spanish colonists at that time. But the name Taos itself would morph or have variations even from this point. Early on in the 1600s, it became known as Don Fernando de Taos. And it was in honor of one of the early settlers, a man by the name of Don Fernando Duran y Chavez. And then this name of Don Fernando de Taos would get another boost in 1796. In 1796, we would have the land grant that was issued at that time that was known as the Don Fernando de Taos land grant, which was in the downtown area around the Taos Plaza. It was given to 63 families, and they would begin building the plaza and building churches and so on. And then the name would morph one more time, and a couple more times in the 1800s because of a prominent Fernandez family It became known as Don Fernandez de Taos, and then even Son Fernandez de Taos. But after the 1800s, then it was shortened again to Taos, which is what we have now. But 1600s didn't go so well for the Spanish. Early on, Oñate was removed from office. There were abuses that took place. Some of the Native Americans were forced to work, to build churches, and even work in the fields. It wasn't to the extent of the repartimientos in Latin America, where there was real harsh forced labor, or even encomiendas. Oñate was given an encomienda, but he only stayed until 1610 and never really got it going that strong. But in any case, there were abuses, especially in the terms of the religion. The Franciscan missionaries were making efforts to convert people to Catholicism, but in that same effort, they also were suppressing native religions, and so signs of discontent were evident early on. Certainly by 1645, we had an event that is known as the Flight to Cuarto, and it was a time that a lot of the people at the Taos Pueblo actually just left and went to some side as far as Kansas, and some would come back, and not all that. So there was still this continuous inhabitants of the Pueblo itself. But by 1680, the Pueblo Revolt 1680 happened. It was a revolt that was organized and led by Popeye and other leaders, actually. It was multiple leadership, but Popeye was pretty much a ringleader. He was a medicine man from the San Juan Pueblo. It's known as San Juan Pueblo at that time. It is now known as the Oke-Owinge. And so the upshot or the downside of the Pueblo Revolt 1680 was that some more than 400 Spanish colonists were killed. Most of the mission churches that had been built were destroyed. Most of the vestiges of Christianity were destroyed. And some 2,000 survivors, Spanish colonist survivors, were forced to retreat out of what present-day New Mexico into an area near El Paso, Texas. And there they would survive as an exiled colony for some 12 years until Don Diego de Vargas would become governor. And then he would organize the effort to come back to New Mexico, reconquer, resettle, recolonize. And so that effort would be complete in 1696, actually when he came to Taos and actually finally convinced the people at Taos Pueblo to put down their arms and make accommodations, and so they did do that. And so things would be different after that. By the 1700s, people that were coming, there was no longer the conquistador that was there for conquest and looking for the quick riches of silver and gold. It was now people that would come up to work the land, to raise livestock, because the Spanish had brought a lot of new livestock to the area that included the horse, the cattle, the sheep, and the hog. And so they could raise these families. The bloodlines of the people now were very different. There were still some Spanish that were still directly from Spain, but for the most part, the population had mixed a lot of mestizos, canizados, Native Americans that were part of this population now that would be settling in the Taos Valley. And they would settle by issuing land grants, building acequias, irrigation ditches in order to irrigate, and generally they were hardworking, God-fearing people that were trying to survive in a very hostile and arid environment. But they were able to do that. But by 1715, then, some important events happened. This was the issuance of the first land grants. These are the oldest land grants after the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 now. The first one would be Cristobal de la Serna land grant in the Ranchos area, and the Higuasa grant. The Serna grant would be issued in early summer 1615, and then the Higuasa grant in the fall of 1615. And the eastern border of the Higuasa land grant would be an acequia, an irrigation ditch. And the ditch was is known as La Acequia de los Lobatos. And I think I did see Juanita Lavadí come in earlier. She wrote an article in the latest Ayer y Hoy the spring edition of 88 on this Acequia de los Novatos that was documented as being here in 1715. It was probably built, they probably started building it even as early as the late 1600s. But the priority date on it, if it needs the priority date for adjudication, would probably be 1615. So it was the earliest land grant. So the 1715 date then denotes the onset or the beginning of land grant history and acequia history in the Taos Valley. So it's another important celebration that's taking place. I don't think that the land grants are all that involved in organizing any celebrations. Actually, any of these anniversary celebrations depends on people actually organizing and putting together celebrations. For example, the Cuarto Centenario, the 400-year celebration of Taos is kind of being recognized, but it's mostly the different groups that are doing that. It's not the city fathers or the county or county government of any kind. And this is not true 50 years ago. In 1965, there was a big article in Taos News celebrating Taos's 350th celebration. Some of you may remember that. So there were extensive activities that were organized by the town of Taos at that time. But again, it varies. The New Mexico Cuarto Centenario, the 400-year anniversary of New Mexico, noting or celebrating the Recolonization, was pretty extensively celebrated by the state of New Mexico. Jamestown, Virginia, 2007. It was celebrated in Jamestown, Virginia, but I did see a little bit of mention on national media, but it was not a national celebration. And Santa Fe, its 400-year celebration almost forgot that it was supposed to happen because almost nothing happened. So it varies from place to place as to whether or not these anniversaries are celebrated, and from time to time. So after 1700, then, now the Spanish were back. More accommodations were being made. Even the Franciscan priests were building mission churches again, but it was a far different approach. It was more, if you want to convert, want to become Christian or Catholic, they were amenable to letting people continue to practice their native religions, and it was not a forced situation near to the point that it had been in the 1600s. So things went better from that standpoint, but it was also still very difficult because something else was happening in the 1700s. And what was happening is that the nomadic Indians, which included the Navajo, the Utes, and Apache, and particularly the Comanches, were raiding into New Mexico and into the Taos Valley just unceasingly, unrelentingly, to the point that they were just about to take out the New Mexico colony at that point. They were about to take over. The Spanish colonists, the Pueblos, were just barely hanging on. Father Dominguez made a trip to Taos in 1776, and he documented that the Spanish colonists that were there were really living basically at the Taos Pueblo, because that's the only place that they could really be very, very secure. And probably the best example of what was happening is what is called the Taos Massacre of 1760. This is an event where thousands of Comanches rode into the Taos Valley, and they did ride in with horses because after the Spanish came here with horses, the horses were quickly acquired by the nomadic tribes and just made them much more mobile. So they rode into the Taos Valley, and they didn't attack the Taos Pueblo, which was a bit more fortified, but they did attack what was known as the Villapando Hacienda, Pablo Villapando Hacienda. Just about all the men were killed, and 50-some women and children were carried off by the Comanches into the plains. And there's one story in particular, the story of Maria Rosa Villapando, that you can look up on Wikipedia or Google. Rosa Villapando. Her story was that she was one of the women who was taken in this raid in 1760, taken to the plains by the Comanches. There she was traded or sold to a plains tribe, And then she was sold to a Frenchman who then took her to St. Louis and married her, had a family. And Maria Rosa Villalpando lived to a grand old age of 90-some and had a large family. And the Jaques family still trace their lineage to her. But an interesting story, check out Maria Rosa Villalpando on whatever source. There are several books on that story also. But so the land grants have been issued, the sectors have been built, and people were trying to eke out a life doing subsistence agriculture. They had it was an agrarian system, but it was communal. They pretty much worked the land together. They had a good part of the land grants were community land grants or had lands in common that they worked together. For example, the pastures would be in common. But regardless of that, then they also had to deal with the weather. I mean, it wasn't always like they had good wet climate. There were a number of years that were definitely dry years, and some years they probably didn't get a harvest, but maybe some years they would get a bumper crop and be able to save for years to come. But on to this stage where the New Mexico colony was trying to survive, steps a man by the name of Juan Bautista de Anza. How many people here have heard the name Juan Bautista de Anza? Okay, several people do. But he's not as well known as other conquistadores such as Coronado or Oñate or de Vargas. But Juan Bautista de Anza, and he has not got his due in history. The only structure or establishment I've heard that had his name is a hotel in Albuquerque. And I'm not even sure it's even open for business anymore. But Mark Simmons called Juan Bautista de Anza a perfect oak of a man. And he had been in the service of the Spanish military in Sonora, Mexico. Then at the time of the missionizing of the California missions in the 1700s, he was part of this effort. And the first mission in California was San Diego in 1769. So take note that it's much after what had been happening in New Mexico. But this was the Spanish colonization and missionizing of California. And so he was part of this, and he was at San Francisco. He was the commander of the first presidio that was built in San Francisco. And in fact, he's given credit in San Francisco for being the founder of San Francisco. But in 1778, he was assigned to become governor of New Mexico, to come and save the colony, basically. And I guess you could basically describe it as being the Kit Carson of, the Hispanic Kit Carson, because he arrived in New Mexico, he made his plans, planned his strategy, and he put together a collection of military people. He had his own military people, but then he also got people from the Pueblo to join in, Genizaros, Mestizos, and he collected his group together at the same place that Oñate had colonized, near the San Juan Pueblo, near the Español area. And so his strategy, he knew he had to use the element of surprise, and so he didn't plan to take a trip. He also knew he had to go and confront the Comanches in their territory. And they controlled all the Comancheria, which was basically all the plains on the Front Range from Wyoming, Colorado, all the way to Texas. And they were superior warriors that just totally controlled as a nation at that point. And so de Anza decided that his strategy would be to not travel through the passes like Raton Pass or La Vida Pass into the plains, but he would go north into the San Luis Valley, and then he would go up over the Rocky Mountains, come down on the other side around Pueblo, Colorado, and he would surprise attack the Comanches, defeat the Comanches, kill the chief, Cuarto Verde, or Greenhorn, and essentially forced the Comanches to come to terms. He was good at diplomacy also, and he used the tactics of divide and conquer, which are very common. He persuaded the Comanches to to come together in alliance with the Spaniards against the Apaches and other nomadic troops, which was a common tactic that was used to divide and conquer. But by 1786, he was able to get a peace treaty with the Comanches, and I'm not sure whether the peace treaty was signed at the Taos Pueblo or the Pecos Pueblo. I've seen historical documentation that says both. It could have been both. Maybe they had more than one meeting, but those were the two primary pueblos, especially for the trading that was going on during that time, because the 1700s was a time that the Taos Trade Fair was ongoing, and these were the two primary locations that this was happening. And that's a whole lecture in itself, but at times it would be peacetime where the nomadic tribes would come and they would take part in this trading, and other times they would come in and it would be raiding rather than trading. So it varied. But the upshot of Juan Bautista de Anza's efforts was that it put a damper on this nomadic Indian threat. Otherwise, even the pueblos may not have continued to survive. Certainly the Spanish colonists probably wouldn't have been able to continue. And so this then opened the door for a new surge of land grant issuing of land grants. Remember in the early 1700s, 1750 was the first ones with the Serna grant and the Goza grant, the Martinez land grant that's west of town. Now there's another cycle of land grant issuing, and this would happen with the Don Fernando de Taos land grant in 1796, and then also in 1796 the Rio Grande del Rancho land grant, which is east of the Serna grant and it's the mountains of the east of that. And that one was issued primarily for grazing, because remember they had all these animals that needed to be grazed, and so it was issued for that purpose. Another land grant that was issued at that time was the community land grant of Arroyo Hondo. And so all of these different land grants that were being issued now then represented a new development, and it increased the number of Spanish-speaking population. Well, prior to this, it probably had never been more than about 300, but now it doubled the size of the Spanish-speaking population. So it was a new point in time. New plazas were built. That's when the Loma Plaza and the Plaza downtown Taos was built. New churches. The first structure for the later Guadalupe Church was around 1801, and of course the San Jeronimo Church had the first one that had been built in 1615. Was destroyed during the Pueblo Revolt, and then it was rebuilt between 1706 and 1726, so it took them about 20 years to build that second one, but it was still there at this time, would be there until American occupation when it was destroyed in 1947. But another church that was built at this time, or in this time frame then, was the Ranchos de Taos church, the Ranchos church that we still see. And the historical record is a little bit ambiguous here. According to the historical record, the permission to build the Ranchos Church was secured in 1813. Matter of fact, late 1813. So probably they didn't have any time to really build in that year, but they had all of 1814. But by the middle of 1815, it was in service, complete with the retablos and all. And so that's why the 200-year, the bicentennial celebration of the Taos Church is being celebrated this year, and quite extensively, actually. Yeah. There will be some publicity on that, but there will be lectures, there will be photo exhibits, PowerPoint presentations, and panel discussions on that bicentennial celebration. But when the church was started is kind of still a question, because most people don't really believe that the historical record is absolutely correct on it, that it was built in that year and a half. And the more likelihood is that it wasn't there in 1776, because when Dominguez came in 1776, he did document that there was a plaza there, but not a church. But sometime after 1776, they could have started making adobes, bringing in large timbers for the vigas, for the roof, and maybe even putting in the foundation. There's no historical documentation to verify that, but looking at it logically, they could have started building. I mean, it wouldn't be the first case of people building something without a building permit here. but anyway, it's a little bit ambiguous, but we definitely celebrate the completion of the Ranchers Church in 1815. After 1815 to 1821, things would begin to change dramatically again. Actually, they had begun to change in 1803 with the Louisiana purchase, the purchase of the Louisiana Territory by the United States. Then by 1806, Zebulon Pike came into the area, into what was in Spanish territory, came into an area north of Taos, near Antonito, Colorado, built a block house, and then the Spanish authorities then went out and arrested him and took him to Santa Fe, and then took him to Chihuahua, and then finally released him. He got back to the United States and published his journals in 1810. And he pretty much resolved the mystery of the Spanish Southwest to the Americans in the East. And so people were starting to come even more. By 1819, the Spanish Empire was becoming pretty weak at that point. It had overstretched its resources and its ability to really hang on to a lot of the territory it had claimed. And so by 1819, the Adams-Onis Treaty was signed. The Spanish gave away their claim to Florida, but they thought that they reaffirmed the claim to the Spanish Southwest. But by 1821, Mexican independence happened, and that essentially created a political political vacuum, and the Mexican governments wouldn't be as diligent about patrolling the borders or even trying to stop people from coming into trade. And so that's when the Santa Fe Trail opened up, and a lot of goods came in from the east. People liked that. And essentially the economic conquest of New Mexico was taking place during this 25-year time period of the Mexican time period. And by the 1840s, James Polk, an expansionist president, was elected. He had campaigned on the platform that he would complete or see Manifest Destiny come to fruition, that the United States, the Manifest Destiny was that the United States would expand from coast to coast. And he was also interested in acquiring an Oregon territory. He first tried to purchase the Southwest from Mexico, but Mexico wasn't willing to sell. So by 1840s, John Fremont was carrying out the junkets of exploration with Kit Carson as his guide, and they traveled as close as Monterey, Mexico, within 25 miles of Monterey, Mexico. And by 1846, then Zachary Taylor was sent into an area between the Rio Grande River and the Nueces River. It was a disputed territory, and both Mexico and Texas, even Texas, had become been annexed by the United States in 1845. But both claimed it, and then Taylor blockaded the Rio Grande River, and then the Mexicans fired on a makeshift fort near Brownsville, Texas, and then President Polk took a war message to Congress that American blood had been shed on American soil. Abraham Lincoln, who was a congressman, wanted to know the exact spot where that American blood had been shed on American soil. Henry David Thoreau chose instead to go to jail rather than pay the taxes for what he considered an unjust war. But in any case, the war was ongoing. The United States then declared war on Mexico. And so by the summer of 1846, Stephen Watts Carney marched into New Mexico down the Santa Fe Trail and occupied New Mexico without firing a shot, and essentially the occupation of New Mexico. And of course there would be resistance, and that resistance we know as the Taos Revolt resistance of 1847. It would be when Governor Bent would be killed, as well as Simeon Turley out at the Turley Mill. Then there was the retribution that happened with Colonel Sterling Price coming back and suppressing the revolt. And so we had the onset of American sovereignty. Actually, the war ended. The Mexican-American War then ended on February 2nd, 1848 with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and then New Mexico would then become a territory of the United States in 1850 with the enactment of the Compromise of 1850. And then we would have, we would be administered as a U.S. territory. Both New Mexico and Taos will be part of that. And a lot of things happened during the territorial period. It's still pretty chaotic. A lot of turf battles going on, battles over land grants, the range wars between the sheepmen and the cattlemen. There were the Colfax County War, the Lincoln County War, the activities of the Civil War, and there are three seminal events in Taos. All of those other events kind of affected Taos to some degree or another, but three seminal events in Taos happened at that time. The first was during the Civil War, when there were Southern sympathizers throughout New Mexico, particularly Southern New Mexico, but some in Taos, and so someone kept tearing down the flag at the Taos Plaza. And so Kit Carson, Captain Smith Simpson, Sedon St. Laurent, a few others, took it upon themselves to guard the flag around the clock, the U.S. flag around the clock on the plaza. And so it was from these activities that the tradition of Taos being one of the few communities that flies the flag around the clock began, and it happened by custom and tradition, because there's no evidence, as far as I know, of any official action ever been taken. No executive order, no legislation or anything. There's something maybe we ought to look into, but maybe we'll get an executive order from the president. But in any case, that was a seminal event at Taos, the flying of the flag on the Taos Plaza. Another important event was the discovery of gold. Well, some gold, not very much gold, at what was known as the Twining. They also mined some copper, but there wasn't to any great degree. But of course, we know now there's Twining in this area where the Blake family began developing the Taos Ski area in the 1950s. And so that was important. Of course, the Taos Ski Valley had a much bigger economic impact than the small amount of mining that did occur, whether for gold or copper at that time. The third important seminal event of the territorial period in Taos then is what is known as the broken wheel episode. This is when artists come in, two artists, Bert Phillips and Ernest Blumenschein, on a trip from Denver, on a sketching trip going to Mexico. Their wheel on their lightweight surrey breaks down near San Cristobal. And so they're forced to take the wheel off. Blumenschein gets the assignment of coming into Taos to have the wheel fixed. And so as soon as he sees Taos, he's maybe not sure that he wants to move to Taos, but he's thinking about an art colony. Bert Phillips decides right away that he would like to move to Taos. And so they begin the process of recruiting other artists to come to Taos. And so by 1915, then the Taos Society of Artists would be formed, and this is the 100-year celebration that we were celebrating this year. It was essentially the launching of Taos as a world-renowned artist colony. And it is significant also because this is what kind of put Taos on the map. Taos had been here for years, and it was very well known in this particular area, but not nationally or not worldwide. But now this would put Taos on the map worldwide. And so those are the four events then that we have for celebration this year. We have the 100-year anniversary of the Taos Artist Colony, the Taos Society of Artists. We have the 200-year anniversary of the completion of the Ranchos Church. We have the 300-year tricentennial anniversary of the beginning of land grant in the Acequia history, and we have the Taos Cuarto Centenario. So with that, I'll be willing to stand for some questions. I know we have some people who know a lot about history here, but the book, do you want to mention the book? Alice, my wife, is here. She is here, and she is selling books. And actually, we might actually be close to running out. So if we do run out, we will take names and either mail you a book or I'll make arrangements for you to get one later. And of course, I don't want to forget the Taos County Historical Society book that is also available. It's the big book. It's got all that packed with information. Mine, I had 3 objectives with my book, and that was I saw a need for a smaller, more compact book that was concise and to the point, number 1. Number 2, that it told the story of Taos, and number 3, that it was affordable. And at $9.95, it's very affordable. We'll give us $10, and we'll give you a nickel and change. So, thank you very much.